The trail was quiet in a way that never felt natural. Not the kind of quiet that came from a calm morning or a still breeze, but the thick kind that made a rider sit up straighter in the saddle. That was the kind of quiet the cowboy felt as his horse carried him along the narrow path that wound through scrub brush and pale dust. He had taken this route many times, enough to know every bend and every stubborn thorn bush, yet something on this day tugged at his attention and made him slow his horse to a walk. The old gelding felt it too. Its ears tipped forward and its steps grew careful as if it wanted to leave no sound behind. The cowboy rested one hand on the saddle horn and looked ahead with a narrowed gaze. He was out checking fence lines and had chosen the abandoned trail only because it cut across miles of land faster than the wide road. Folks said the trail had been left alone for years after storms washed out a section near the ridge, but he never paid much mind to stories like that. Land shifted and changed all the time. If a rider knew where to place his weight and how to keep a horse steady, there was nothing to worry about. Still, as he rode forward, that uneasy quiet clung to him like a thin layer of fog. His horse let out a sharp huff as if catching a scent in the air. The cowboy gave a gentle tug on the reins and stopped. He listened. Nothing moved. No whine through the brush, no chirp from a hidden bird, no sound from any nearby cattle. It felt wrong. He glanced behind him, half expecting someone to emerge on the trail, but only dust hung in the air. He muttered something low to his horse, a calm reassurance, though he could feel the tension building inside his chest. He nudged the gelding forward again, slower this time, scanning the ground ahead. The abandoned trail held an odd mix of deep hoof marks and lighter prints he could not immediately place. He leaned forward in the saddle and studied them more closely. They did not look like the prints from cattle or any grown horse. These were smaller, clustered tight like something young had moved through in a hurry. The cowboy frowned. A rancher in the area had not mentioned missing any colts. Even wild herds rarely passed through this part anymore, not since the waterline shifted and pushed them farther out. He glanced around again, instincts rising, and followed the prints deeper along the trail. The shadows grew longer between the tall brush, and the air felt heavier. Something lay ahead, something just beyond his view, and its presence pulled at him with a strange mix of worry and curiosity. He urged the gelding on and soon spotted a shape lying near the base of a slanted cottonwood tree. His horse stopped on its own, lowering its head as if unsure whether to step closer. The cowboy tightened his grip on the reins and took in the sight. At first, he could not tell what he was looking at. It was small, curled tight, almost blending with the dusty soil. Slowly he dismounted, boots landing with a soft thud. He moved forward with caution, giving the shape enough space in case it was something wild or injured. When he reached the cottonwood, he knelt down and brushed away some of the dust with the edge of his glove. The realization stopped him cold. It was a foal. A tiny one, still thin-legged, its coat patchy from lack of grooming. It lay curled on its side, breathing shallowly. The cowboy froze, stunned not only by its presence but by how fragile it looked. He glanced up, scanning the trail again, expecting the mother to come charging around the corner. But the trail remained empty and still. His heart tightened in concern. A young foal, this small never wandered off on its own. Something must have happened. His horse let out a low whinny, ears still forward, and shuffled as if sensing the tension. The cowboy raised a hand to calm it, though he was far from calm himself. He looked over the small body once more and noticed something else. Another shape, just a little farther off, half hidden in the shadows. He stood up quickly and stepped toward it. As he got closer, his breath hitched. A second foal. This one appeared slightly stronger, though still young and clearly frightened. It lifted its head at the sound of his steps, eyes wide and dark with alarm. The cowboy stopped and crouched, speaking softly, careful not to show any sudden movement. He could see its sides rising and falling fast with panic. He could also see faint scratches on its coat, maybe from pushing through thick brush or scrambling across rough ground. Whatever happened to them, it had left both young ones shaken and alone. He looked between the two foals, confusion settling deep inside him. Two abandoned foals on a trail that had not seen riders in years made no sense. Wild marais did not leave their young behind without a reason, and ranch stock was kept far from here. He lifted his hat and ran a hand through his hair, trying to piece together any explanation. None came. The bigger foal tried to stand but stumbled, nearly falling before catching itself. It looked toward the smaller one as if worried, letting out a faint sound that barely reached the cowboy's ears. The smaller foal twitched but did not rise. The cowboy felt a knot form in his throat. He had seen orphaned animals before, but never like this, never two at once. Never in such a deserted place. He walked back to his horse and rummaged through his saddlebag for the small canteen he carried. He knew foals needed special care, milk from a mare or at least some mix that ranch hands kept for emergencies. Water alone would not help enough, but it might give them strength to stay awake. He returned to the smaller foal first and poured a little into his palm, offering it gently. The foal's lips brushed his hand and took a tiny sip. It was not much, but it was something. He stayed like that for several minutes, moving between the two young ones, giving small sips, speaking calm words, and trying not to let the worry show on his face. He knew he had to get them help, and soon, leaving them alone was not an option. But the man also knew his horse could not carry two foals at once, not safely. He would need to think this through, choose his next steps carefully. The sky above took on a deeper tone as clouds drifted in, hinting at a change in weather. Wind finally picked up, brushing through the brush and stirring up the dust. The cowboy felt the shift and knew time was growing short. He stood and looked back down the trail, trying to measure the distance to the nearest ranch. He could ride fast and return with a wagon, but that meant leaving the foals unattended. If whatever forced them onto this trail returned, they would be helpless. He paced a few steps, mind working hard, weighing risks he did not want to take. Something about the entire scene felt wrong, more wrong than simple abandonment. He felt eyes on him, though he knew that was only nerves. Still, he kept glancing over his shoulder, scanning the brush, waiting for any sign of movement. His horse shifted again, this time with more urgency. Its head rose higher, ears turning sharply. The cowboy frowned and stepped beside it, laying a hand on its neck. The animal was tense, ready to bolt if needed. That set his nerves on edge even more. Horses sensed danger before humans did, and his gelding did not spook easily. The trail behind them remained empty, but the feeling that something was growing near clung to the air. The cowboy returned his gaze to the two foals, both now watching him with tired eyes. He felt responsible for them in a way he could not explain. He knew he could not leave, yet he also knew staying put might be risky. A faint sound drifted through the air. Not loud, not clear, but enough to make him freeze. He turned toward the ridge, heart pounding once more. The sound came again, muffled but unmistakable. Something was out there on the trail. Something moving toward him. He kept one hand on his horse, the other ready to guide the foals if he had to act fast. The wind carried another faint sound, then silence. Whatever was coming was getting closer. And the cowboy had no idea if it meant help or danger. The cowboy kept still, his breath held tight in his chest as he listened for that sound again. It came faintly, a soft shift of weight on dry ground. His horse twitched beneath his hand, muscles tight as rope. The foals stayed low, their bodies pressed into the earth as if they understood danger. Everything around him narrowed to that single approaching noise. He watched the trail until his eyes stung, nothing moved. But he could feel it, something out there, something steady and deliberate. He angled himself so he could keep both the trail and the foals in sight. The wind brought a low groan from the cottonwood tree, but nothing more. A few seconds passed, then more, long enough to make him wonder if it had only been his mind playing tricks. But his horse was anxious, the kind of anxious no trick of the imagination could cause. He trusted that more than his own ears. Whatever was making those sounds was close. Then the noise stopped altogether, swallowed by the growing wind. The cowboy's pulse stayed high, though he made himself breathe slow again, focusing on the foals. For now, they were quiet, calm only in the way tired animals became calm when their strength ran low. He could not waste time worrying about shadows and sounds. He needed to understand why these two young foals had ended up here. He knelt beside the larger one, checking for injuries he might have missed earlier. Its breathing had evened out, though it still looked deeply unsettled. He brushed some bits of dried brush from its coat and noticed how thin it was. Its ribs showed faintly, not enough to alarm but enough to make him wonder how long it had been without proper care. The smaller one shifted a little, and he moved to check on it too. He felt along its legs, gentle but firm, making sure there were no breaks or swollen joints. Everything seemed in place, though the foal was clearly weak. He sat back and tried to make sense of the situation. The trail didn't see much movement anymore. Only a few riders used it, mostly ranch hands trying to shave off time while checking fence lines or moving small groups of cattle. No one would leave foals on a trail like this by accident, and if a wild herd had been pushed off course, he would have seen more tracks. Something else had happened, something unexplained. His mind drifted back to the stories he had heard from old hands over long nights near campfires. Stories about strange happenings on the fringes of grazing land. Shadows seen near abandoned trails, odd noises at dusk. He had always taken those tales as nothing more than tired imaginations. But now he wondered if there was some truth hidden inside them. The cowboy shook off the thought and forced himself to focus. He looked again at the trail where he had heard the noise earlier. The breeze had calmed, leaving the air heavy with the scent of dust and dry grass. He saw no movement. Still, he felt watched, not by something hostile, but by something cautious, something waiting. His horse snorted softly, restless but not panicked. The cowboy gave it a pat on the neck and whispered something steadying. He needed to keep the animal calm if they were going to make it through whatever this was. A skittish horse could get them all hurt. He stood and walked a few steps toward the ridge, leaving the foals only briefly. He scanned the area again, taking in the quiet brush, the slanted cottonwood tree, and the trail stretched thin behind him. Then he saw something he had missed before, something faint and half buried under dust. A broken piece of rope? He crouched and picked it up. It looked like part of a lead rope, the kind ranchers used to guide young horses. But this piece had been torn, not cut. The fibers were uneven and frayed, like something had yanked it hard enough to snap it in half. He ran the rope between his fingers, trying to imagine the force needed to break it. A foal alone could not do that. A frightened Mary might. But if a Mari had been with them, she would not have left her young behind. Not unless she had been forced away. The cowboy tucked the rope into his belt, his thoughts twisting in uneasy circles. He wanted answers, but all he found were more questions. He turned back to the foals, feeling even more protective of them now. They blinked at him with wide, uncertain eyes, trusting him out of instinct more than understanding. He walked back to his horse and grabbed a thin blanket from behind the saddle. It wasn't thick, but it could help warm the smaller foal. He laid it gently over its back, careful not to startle it. The foal tensed for a moment, then relaxed when it realized the blanket offered comfort, not harm. The cowboy sat beside them, watching the sky shift from pale to deeper color as the sun crossed behind the clouds. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing harder. He needed to act soon or risk losing the weaker foal altogether. The bigger one might manage a little longer, but the small one needed help now. He considered lifting the smaller foal onto his horse and carrying it ahead, then coming back for the other one, but that meant leaving one alone. He didn't like that choice. He knew the nearest ranch had a wagon and some supplies that could help, but it was still several miles away. Riding there, returning, loading the foals carefully, then transporting them back would take more time than he wanted to risk. He needed another way. He stood restless, pacing a slow circle around the foals as he searched for an answer that wasn't clear. His horse followed his movement with uneasy eyes. The wind picked up again, but instead of bringing comfort, it only added to his nerves. The sounds around them grew sharper, quick snaps of brush pushing against each other. Then the cowboy froze. His eyes landed on prints he hadn't noticed before, half covered by the earlier dust. They were large, heavier than horse prints, and deeper. They moved across the trail at an angle as if something big had passed through not long ago. The tracks were old enough to be partly faded, but fresh enough to trace their direction. He crouched and touched the edge of one. Whatever made this print had weight behind it. He looked toward the ridge where the sound had come from earlier. A chill crept along his spine. Maybe the noise hadn't been a coincidence. Maybe whatever passed through here had scared the foals enough to send them running. He rose slowly and backed toward the foals, his sense of caution rising higher. If something dangerous had been on this trail, it could still be nearby. But he didn't want to move the foals too quickly and risk injuring them. He needed to stay calm for them, even though every instinct told him to stay alert. The foals shifted again, the bigger one pushing itself to its feet more steadily this time. It staggered but held its balance, its eyes fixed on the cowboy as if waiting for direction. He moved closer, hands out, speaking in a soft tone. The foal responded to his voice, stepping toward him with small, uneven strides. The smaller one tried to mimic the movement but collapsed gently back onto its side. It was too weak to stand. The cowboy knelt beside it again, speaking softly, brushing its coat with slow strokes. He felt that familiar knot tighten in his chest once more. He couldn't let anything happen to these two. His mind churned. There had to be a way. He could use the blanket as a sling of sorts, tying it to the saddle to support part of the smaller foal's weight. It wouldn't be perfect, but it might work. He began testing the blanket, checking its strength. It was worn but sturdy enough for the short ride he needed to make. He was just starting to tie the first knot when the wind carried a sound that made him stop. A low rumble, distant but steady. He knew that sound. Hooves, not one set, but several. A group. He straightened, listening hard. His horse stiffened again, ears pointing toward the sound. The rumble grew clearer, moving along the ridge in a slow, controlled pace. They weren't wild. Wild horses didn't move like that. This was a group of riders. For a moment, he felt relief, help. Then another thought hit him. Not all riders on these trails came with good intentions. And if these foals had been taken or separated by someone, the returning riders might not be on his side. He stepped between the foals and the direction of the sound, planting his boots firmly in the dirt as the rumble grew closer. He didn't know who was coming or what they wanted. He only knew he wasn't leaving the foals behind. Not now, not with riders closing in on the abandoned trail. The rumble of hooves rolled across the ridge like distant thunder. The cowboy stayed where he stood, trying to judge how many riders were approaching. His horse shifted from one leg to the other, anxious but not panicking. The foals pressed close behind him, instinct pulling them toward the only thing in sight that felt safe. The cowboy placed a steady hand on his gelding's neck, hoping to keep both the animal and himself grounded. He listened carefully. The hoofbeats weren't wild or scattered. They were patterned, controlled. Whoever rode toward him knew how to handle a group of horses, which meant they were experienced. Maybe that should have eased his nerves, but instead it made his stomach tighten. Experience didn't guarantee safety. It only meant whoever came held confidence, and confidence on a lonely trail like this could come from all the wrong reasons. The sound grew louder, then slowed. The riders had pulled up just beyond the ridge. The cowboy waited, straining to catch voices. There were murmurs, low and cautious, as if they too were unsure what lay ahead. For a brief moment, the cowboy wondered if they had spotted tracks of the foals or the rope he found earlier. Maybe they were searching for something. Or someone. He risked a whisper to the foals, mostly to comfort himself. The larger one nuzzled his sleeve gently, as if sensing his unease. The smaller one had regained a bit of strength and managed to lift its head, though it still lay weak against the blanket. Their trust in him, fragile as it was, tightened his resolve. He couldn't let anything happen to them. A single rider appeared at the top of the ridge. The cowboy's eyes narrowed. He didn't recognize the figure, but the horse was tall and broad-chested, a sign of long travel and endurance. The rider scanned the trail until their gaze settled on the cowboy. The cowboy didn't move. Neither did the rider. A few seconds passed in stillness before the rider raised one hand, a slow, calm gesture. More riders followed behind, forming a loose line along the ridge. There were 4 in total, maybe 5, depending on whether a shadow at the far end belonged to a person or simply brush shifting. They were quiet, too quiet for a simple passing group. Something in their posture said they weren't here on leisure or chance. The cowboy held his place, refusing to show nerves. He didn't step forward, didn't retreat, didn't reach for anything. He knew how quickly misunderstandings could turn dangerous out here. The lead rider nudged their horse forward and descended the ridge at an easy pace. When they reached the bottom, they reined in several yards away. "What are you doing on this trail?" the rider asked. The cowboy kept his voice steady. "Checking fence lines." "Took a shorter path." The rider nodded once, though the expression under the brim of their hat stayed unreadable. Their horse pawed at the dirt, restless. The cowboy noticed their eyes shift briefly toward the foals behind him. That moment told him the riders already knew what he had found, or had expected to find something. "You come across anything unusual?" the rider asked. The cowboy hesitated. His mind moved quick, trying to read the tone. The question was casual on the surface, but something underneath it felt too practiced, as if they were testing him. He didn't like that. "What kind of unusual?" he asked. The rider gave a slow shrug. "Anything out of place." The cowboy knew he couldn't lie. The foals were in plain sight, but he also didn't want to give away more than he had to. He stepped aside just enough for the riders to see the young horses clearly. The lead rider stared, jaw tightening. "We've been tracking prints," the rider said. "Thought they came this way." The cowboy nodded but didn't speak. He wanted the rider to keep talking, to give him a clue as to what these people wanted. "How long have they been with you?" the rider asked. "Just found them," the cowboy answered. They were alone. A faint shift of posture went through the riders on the ridge, almost as if they exchanged some silent signal. The cowboy caught the movement out of the corner of his eye and felt a chill run along his spine. The lead rider studied him for a long moment. "You see any signs of a mare? Any tracks?" "Just these two," the cowboy said. "Found a piece of broken rope nearby." "That's it." The rider's eyes darkened with something like frustration mixed with worry. "We were told a pair of young ones got separated. We've been trying to catch up to them." The cowboy didn't respond. Something didn't line up. If these foals belonged to ranch stock, someone should have said something earlier. And the rope he found looked rough and weathered, not like something freshly broken. So why would this group be out searching with such urgency? Before he could ask anything, the lead rider shifted in the saddle. "We'd like to take a closer look at them." The cowboy didn't move. "They're scared. And weak. They don't need strangers crowding them." The rider's eyes snapped back to him. For the first time, there was a clear edge in the gaze, a subtle tension that said the discussion might not stay calm much longer. The cowboy felt the air tighten around them. His instincts pushed him to be careful. "They're better off with people who know what they're dealing with," the rider said. The cowboy kept his voice level. "I'm not stopping anyone from helping, but I'm not letting anyone rush them either." A long silence passed. The riders shifted again on the ridge, uneasy with how the talk was going. The lead rider tugged lightly on the reins but didn't move forward. "What's your name?" the rider asked. The cowboy paused. He didn't like being asked that, not out here, not in this tone. But refusing would only make the moment sharper. He gave a simple answer, no details attached. The lead rider nodded slowly. "We're on contract to track missing stock." These foals matched the description. Something about the phrasing caught the cowboy's attention. Contract, not ranch hands, not neighbors. Contracted riders, hired for a job. And jobs like that didn't always come from the most honest sources. Before he could question it, the smaller foal let out a faint cry. The cowboy knelt quickly, checking it again. The larger one stepped closer to him too, its eyes fixed on the riders with fear. The lead rider watched the interaction, something unreadable in their expression. "They're attached to you already," the rider said. "Animals choose who they trust." "Sometimes faster than people expect." The cowboy didn't look up. "Then you know why I'm not handing them over just yet." Another long silence followed. The wind blew across the ridge, kicking up a thin swirl of dust. The riders shifted, and for a moment the cowboy thought one would descend farther, but the lead rider raised a hand, holding them back. "We'll camp up on the ridge?" the rider finally said. "Check the area at first light. Things move easier when the sun's up." The cowboy knew better than to think the group was simply giving up for the night. They were watching him, waiting to see what he would do. He nodded anyway, keeping his expression plain. The riders turned and moved back up the ridge. Their silhouettes stayed visible for a long time, even after they stopped at the top. They were not leaving. They were staying close. The cowboy stayed kneeling beside the foals, his breathing slow and steady even though his heart was clenched tight. His horse lowered its head, ears still locked on the ridge, as if expecting trouble to return. Now the cowboy understood the real problem. Those riders weren't just searching for the foals. They were guarding something about them, something the cowboy didn't know yet. Something someone wanted kept quiet. He looked down at the foals again, both now leaning into him for warmth or comfort. Whatever their past held, whatever drove them onto this abandoned trail, he was tangled in it now. And with riders watching from the ridge and nighttime creeping across the land, he knew the real conflict was only beginning to unfold. The light faded fast, pulling long shadows across the abandoned trail until everything looked stretched thin and uneasy. The ridge where the riders waited turned darker by the minute. Their silhouettes stayed fixed like markers carved into the land. The cowboy kept watch without letting it show, tending to the foals in small, quiet movements while his mind spun with every possible danger that could come crawling out of the night. The bigger foal rested its head against his leg, trembling each time the wind pushed through the brush. The smaller one slept in quick, shallow breaths, the blanket keeping what little warmth it had left. The cowboy knelt beside them and listened to the quiet shift of their breathing, trying to steady his own nerves. He kept an ear tilted toward the ridge, though he knew those riders weren't likely to charge down in the dark. Experienced riders didn't rush a situation they couldn't see clearly, but the stillness didn't comfort him. It only meant they were planning something. His horse stood close, a steady shape in the dark. The gelding's presence helped, even though the animal stayed alert, ears twitching toward any sound. It was loyal and calm, qualities that mattered more now than ever. The cowboy scratched the side of the horse's neck, letting the touch reassure both of them. He whispered something low, making sure not to draw attention from the ridge. He knew he couldn't stay here until dawn. The riders claimed they would search in the morning, but he didn't trust the ease in their words. There was something off about the way they reacted to the foals. Something too quick, too quiet. Their interest felt less like concern and more like unfinished business. He needed time to think, and he needed distance. But moving the foals in the dark was risky. The trail twisted in narrow ways, and the small one might not survive a rough ride. The cowboy eased onto his heels and surveyed the area. He forced himself to think like he would during long cattle drives when storms pushed in from the south. If he had limited time and weak livestock, where would he move them first? The answer came slowly, rising from memory. There was a dry wash not far from the trail, just hidden enough to break sight from the ridge. If he could reach that spot, even for a bit, it would give him space to regroup. The foals could rest there without being watched. But getting them there meant risking the riders noticing him slip away. The cowboy rubbed his jaw, thinking through each step. He had to move quietly. He couldn't let the foals make noise that carried up the ridge. And he had to be fast enough that by the time the riders realized he shifted position, he would already be gone from sight. The larger foal nudged him gently, as if sensing something heavy in his thoughts. He gave it a soft pat, trying to calm the rising tension in its body. Animals understood fear even in silence. These two had already been through enough. The cowboy checked the sky. Clouds blocked much of the moonlight, giving him cover but making the path harder to see. He weighed the risk, then finally decided. Staying here was the greater danger. He had to move. He gathered his rope slowly, making sure the horse didn't clatter its hooves. Every sound seemed too loud, even the quiet brush of leather shifting. His fingers worked in steady motions, tying a soft lead around the larger foal, gentle enough not to frighten it. Then he carefully scooped the smaller foal with the blanket still wrapped around it. The young one stirred but didn't cry out. He held it close, steadying its body against his chest. The cowboy whispered to the bigger foal first, giving it the comfort of tone more than the meaning of the words. Then he guided his horse forward, leading them toward the wash. The trail felt different in the dark. Each rise and dip seemed sharper, each shadow looked deeper. The cowboy kept his steps light, trying not to leave clear prints for the riders to see if they decided to come down early. The gelding walked soft, its hooves placed with care. The bigger foal moved unsteadily, but it followed the rope without fighting. The cowboy whispered encouragement each time the foal hesitated, hoping his calm voice outweighed its fear. Halfway to the wash, the cowboy paused, lifting his head toward the ridge. A faint glow flickered up there. Lanterns. The riders were moving, not riding, but shifting camp. The glow wasn't bright enough to travel by, but bright enough to talk by. They were planning something. The cowboy tightened his grip on the smaller foal. He pushed his group forward more quickly, still silent but more urgent. He scanned the ground for the break in the brush, trying to spot the narrow dip that marked the entrance to the wash. Just before he found it, the wind shifted and carried voices from the ridge. He couldn't make out every word, but the tone chilled him. It was the tone of people who weren't giving up. Not because they cared, but because they had orders. Strong ones. He caught pieces. Not supposed to lose them. Don't want trouble with the owner. Check again at first light. Those words confirmed everything he had feared. Someone wanted those foals badly. Bad enough to hire riders to track them through an abandoned trail. But why? Foals this young weren't usually worth that much unless they were bred from something rare or valuable. But even then, no honest ranch would keep secrets like this. He pushed the thoughts aside as the wash came into view, a thin cut in the land almost invisible in the darkness. He motioned the horse inside first, then guided the larger foal down the slope. When both were safe, he climbed down carefully while holding the smaller one. Inside the wash, the air felt hidden, protected by slanted walls that blocked the view from above. The cowboy moved to the far end where a small hollow dipped low. Here, they could rest without being seen from the ridge. He set the smaller foal down gently on the blanket and let it settle into the soft dirt. The larger one stayed close, lowering its head toward its sibling as if reassuring it. The cowboy took a slow breath, letting the silence settle. He finally had a moment to think without eyes on him. He replayed the day, piece by piece, the broken rope, the deep prints in the dirt, the way the foals reacted to noises, the riders appearing just when he found them. All of it formed a picture that felt unsettling. Maybe someone tried to transport the foals and lost control. Maybe the mare panicked and ran off. Or maybe someone tried to take the foals and something went wrong. He couldn't know yet. The only thing he understood clearly was this. If he handed the foals over, he might never know the truth. And the truth mattered, especially when innocent animals were involved. He reached for his canteen and offered the larger foal a small drink. Then he knelt by the smaller one again, pressing his ear lightly near its side to check its breathing. Still weak, still fragile, but alive. As he worked, the cowboy heard faint movement from above. Not close, but close enough to remind him this hiding place wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the riders would come down from that ridge to check on him. And when they found him gone, they'd know something wasn't right. He needed a plan before dawn. Something that would give him and the foals a chance to escape, or at least stay hidden long enough to understand what he was dealing with. He thought of the landmarks ahead. There was an old ravine that fed into a dry creek bed farther south. If he could reach that before the riders closed in, he could put miles between them. But the path was rough and narrow. The smaller foal might not survive the journey. He rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of every decision pressing harder. Time was thinning fast. The riders weren't going to wait until sunrise. If they suspected he was hiding something, they'd come early. And from the tension he sensed before, they were already suspicious. The cowboy checked the ridge again. The lantern glow still flickered. Shapes moved around it. They weren't resting. They were preparing. The cowboy felt his pulse pick up. Whatever was coming next would decide everything. The foals shifted closer to him as if sensing the rising tension. Their trust made the weight on his shoulders even heavier. He wasn't sure how he would protect them, but he knew he had to try. Above them, the rustle of movement grew a little louder. The riders were mounting up. They were coming down from the ridge, and the night hadn't even reached its darkest point yet. The riders reached the base of the ridge before the cowboy even had time to steady his breath. Their horses moved with quiet purpose, hooves brushing through the brush with practiced steps. The cowboy kept still inside the wash, holding the larger foal close and keeping one hand on the smaller one. He could hear the low murmur of voices as the riders spread out, scanning the trail like men who had done this many times before. For a moment, he wondered if they could hear his heartbeat pounding in the small space around him. The wash felt tighter with every second. He stayed crouched low, listening to every sound. His horse stayed still behind him, well trained, barely making a breath louder than the shifting wind. A rider paused near the wash entrance. The cowboy could tell by the sound of gravel sliding under a boot. The rider dismounted and walked in slow steps, scanning the ground. The cowboy tensed, shielding the foals with his body, ready to stand if he had to. He didn't want to fight, didn't want trouble, but he wouldn't hand over the foals until he knew the truth. The rider crouched somewhere above him, brushing fingers over the dirt. The cowboy heard a frustrated sigh, followed by one short sentence. "No tracks going in?" The man climbed back on his horse without searching deeper. If he had stepped just a little farther, he would have spotted the hollow, but luck stayed with the cowboy. The riders regrouped, their voices drifting through the darkness. "He's not here. He left. Then we go south. Owner wants them found before daylight." The cowboy caught that line clearly. It told him everything he needed. These men weren't wandering ranch hands. They worked for someone with enough influence to expect results fast. Someone who had the resources to track two helpless foals and was desperate enough to send riders after them. When the sound of hooves faded, the cowboy finally let a breath escape. His shoulders relaxed, though only a little. He knew the danger wasn't gone. The riders had guessed his direction. They would search the south trail next, and the wash wouldn't hide them once the sun rose. He gathered the foals again and lowered his head close to them as if they could understand his whisper. "We move now." The cowboy guided his horse out first, checking the ridge and trail. No lanterns glowed anymore. The riders were gone. The night had settled heavy once again. He led the larger foal out slowly, making sure its steps stayed quiet. Then he lifted the smaller foal, wrapped tightly in the blanket, and secured it carefully against him. The old ravine waited far ahead. It wasn't just a path. It was a way to reach a ranch he trusted. A ranch run by an older woman named Mara, someone he had worked with before and who cared about animals more than profits. If anyone knew what to do with two fragile foals being hunted by hired riders, it was her. The cowboy moved through the trails with more speed now, weaving through brush and stones. His horse handled the path well, clearing fallen branches without fuss. The night wind chilled him as it passed, but it kept him alert. The larger foal stumbled a few times, but each time he paused to let it regain its balance before urging it forward again. Hours passed in slow, heavy steps. The horizon gradually began to lighten. Birds started their morning calls, soft at first, then louder. The air shifted from night to early dawn, revealing faint outlines of distant hills. Just beyond the next bend lay the ravine. The cowboy reached it just as the first thin streak of sunlight touched the land. The walls of the ravine rose sharply, offering cover and quiet. He guided his horse down the slope and held the rope steady so the larger foal wouldn't slip. Then he carried the smaller one down carefully. At the bottom, the ravine stretched long and winding, its path shaded by tall brush. It was a safe route, hidden from the rider's likely trail. The cowboy felt hope spark inside him for the first time that night. As he followed the ravine, the ground leveled out and widened. The air warmed slowly. The foals perked up with each new sound of morning life drifting through the brush. Even the smaller ones seemed to breathe a little deeper, as if the rising sun gave it strength. By mid-morning, the cowboy reached the dry creek bed that marked the outer edge of Mara's land. Relief washed through him. The fences stood in the distance, simple wooden lines stretching across the field like a welcome sign. The cowboy whistled softly. A ranch hand across the pasture lifted his head, spotted him, and cupped his hands around his mouth to call out a greeting. But the cowboy only raised a hand in return, signaling urgency. The ranch hand understood right away and rushed toward the main house. By the time the cowboy reached the yard, Mara herself was stepping out with her hair tied back and her boots still dusty from early chores. She stopped at the sight of the foals and narrowed her eyes with that sharp, old instinct of hers. "Where in the world did you find them?" The cowboy let out a breath he'd been holding since before dawn. "Trouble found them first." Mara didn't ask for details yet. She motioned him inside the barn where the air stayed cool and the light slanted in warm strips on the hay. Together they set the foals down on fresh bedding. Mara examined them carefully, brushing her hand along their sides, checking their legs, their temperature, their breathing. "The small one is weak," she said, "but not lost. The bigger one will be fine with some rest." She stepped back and looked at the cowboy, waiting for the story. He told her everything: the trail, the broken rope, the riders, their talk of an owner, their determination to find the foals by daylight. Mara listened without interrupting, her face calm but thoughtful. When he finished, she folded her arms. "I think I know who claims to own them," she said. "And if I'm right, those foals aren't property. They were taken." The cowboy felt the weight of her words. Mara explained that a ranch to the north had a history of shady dealings. They bred valuable horses but refused to follow proper care standards. They had been fined before. Recently, locals whispered about newborn animals disappearing without proper records. Mara had been trying to gather information, but nothing had been clear. "Until now, these foals got away somehow," Mara said. "Maybe the Murray fought back. Maybe someone tried to rescue them but failed. But whoever sent those riders isn't working for honest reasons." The cowboy felt something settle inside him, a sense of purpose stronger than the fear he felt last night. "So what do we do?" he asked. Mara placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "We protect them, and we report what we know. Lawmen will take this seriously if we provide proof." They spent the afternoon caring for the foals. The smaller one improved slowly, drinking warm milk in small amounts. The bigger one nuzzled the cowboy's hand often, seeking comfort. It stayed close to its sibling, giving quiet little nudges as if promising not to leave. Later, the sheriff arrived after Mara sent a rider to fetch him. The cowboy repeated the details while Mara added what she knew about the ranch up north. The sheriff took notes and nodded with a serious look. "You did right by bringing them here," the sheriff said. "We'll handle the rest. Those riders won't trouble you now. They'll have to answer questions of their own." Relief drifted through the cowboy's chest, leaving him lighter than he had felt in days. Mara placed a warm cup of coffee in his hands and nodded toward the barn. "Go on," she said. "Sit with them for a while. They trust you." The cowboy settled on a bale of hay beside the foals. The barn smelled of fresh straw and warm sunlight. The larger foal curled beside his leg, resting its head on his boot. The smaller one slept peacefully, no longer trembling, wrapped in a fresh blanket. He watched them breathe, feeling the simple rise and fall like a rhythm that settled his own heart. They were safe now. Safe in a place where people cared, not because of value or ownership, but because it was the right thing to do. By evening, the sky glowed in warm colors across the ranch. The cowboy stood at the barn door, watching the fields stretch far and quiet. Mara joined him and leaned on the post beside him. "Funny thing," she said. "Sometimes the smallest lives bring out the biggest truths." He nodded, thinking of the long night, the riders, the uncertainty. But he also thought of the courage it took to protect something fragile, and the way compassion could turn fear into purpose. The foals would grow strong here. They would get the care they deserved, and the truth behind their escape would come to light soon enough. As the sun dipped low, the cowboy felt a sense of calm settle over him. The land felt peaceful. The danger had passed, and the story he carried now was one worth remembering, not about fear, but about doing what was right even when the night felt too dark to stand in. And that, he realized, was the real heart of the journey.